Hi, everyone. I'd like to kick off our next session, Modular versus Monolithic Blockchains. Our host is Arnav Pagidyala, principal at HashKey Capital, with speakers Jayendra Jog, co-founder of Sei Labs, and Aniruch P, partner at Dragonfly.
Awesome. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you guys for hosting this event. You guys have done an incredible job. I guess to kick it off, I think really timely topic, especially with the Solana altcoin season, and then we have a lot of maybe alt L1s launching, like your monads, your Barra chains, a lot of interesting stuff in the L2 layer with SVMs, parallelism, so much cool stuff going on, and I think these guys can definitely shine some light on it. So I guess real quick, if you guys just want to give an introduction about who you guys are and what you're working on, I think that'd be great.
So my name is Jay. I'm a co-founder of Sei. Over at Sei, we're building the first parallelized EVM.
Thanks to the Harvard blockchain for hosting this. It's been great so far. But yeah, I'm Ani. I'm a partner at Dragonfly. We manage a few billion in crypto VC globally.
Sweet. I guess to just take it from the top, can you guys define modular and monolithic? And then I guess also define the motivations for choosing one or the other to build your application on.
Cool. So I guess we could just take turns. In terms of modular versus monolithic, I would define a monolithic chain as one where every single component of the stack is maintained by the chain itself. I think at this point it's broadly agreed that there's either 3 or 4 separate parts that go into a modular chain. It would be the execution layer, the settlement layer, and the data availability / consensus layers. We can do more of a deep dive over there, but I would highly define it as a monolithic chain is one where all 3 components are integrated into one chain. Examples of this would be your classical chains like Solana, where everything just happens as part of one chain. On the other side of that would be modular chains, where you have every single part is broken up, and there's different, services you can use for each of these. Example over here would be having your own execution layer, then using something like Dimension for settlement, and then using something like Celestia for DA.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, and I think what's been interesting to us in the projects that we've seen is, even a few years ago, the kind of demand for flexibility as it pertained to all the different layers was very nascent, and you didn't see many people, I think, take full advantage of that outside of the Cosmos ecosystem. But I think in our times, at least, contemporary last 2 years, it's just been a Cambrian explosion of people trying out all these things. I think whether or not consequentially things will emerge from that, I guess remains to be seen, because the canonical example of a lot of people kind of creating their own app rollup is to give MEV back to say token holders or something like that. I think that's still in the beginning stages, but I think we are entering a world where all that greater flexibility will lead to hitherto unknown possibilities. So.
Yeah, and I think the flexibility part is probably the single most important factor for modular chains. I think what it really unlocks is the ability to experiment really, really quickly. If you're trying to build your own L1, where you have to build every single component from scratch, you need to get your own validator set, you need to have your own, generally you have to come up with a novel consensus mechanism, improvement to the execution layer as well. It's really, really difficult to do that. Whereas if you only want to make a slight tweak to the execution layer, and then you want to use someone else's approach for settlement, someone else's DA, it's very, very easy to get started with the modular approach. And I think that's where modular chains are going to be shining in the near future. It really allows for faster experimentation.
Yeah, I would add there's this term called Nielsen's law, which is bandwidth consumption doubles every 21 months. And when that was first made, people had no idea what they would use bandwidth for, right? I mean, it was relatively new. The internet hadn't really picked up in full force, much as it has now, especially over the past 5 years. But we always find a way to consume more energy, more bandwidth, more computing power, especially now. And I think that's very much true with blockchains, where supply, in a weird way, almost creates its own demand, I think, over enough period of time. And I think we're too early to create, something like Jay's law or something like that, where, the supply itself will be very important. But one could say, I guess 10 years from now, if we were to the past, the rise of AI agents and all these things, I guess, happening on-chain will lead to this supply just being utilized in a great way.
Yeah, thank you guys. Those are both great takes. So I guess at a high level, the difference between, why do you want to build on modular versus monolithic, I guess on the monolithic side, obviously, it's a much cleaner UX, obviously higher throughput. And on the modular side, obviously, you can also customize your own app layer and sovereignty as well, where you're not built on the L1. And then I guess on the modular side, you can tap in like ETH network effects, users, dev tooling, liquidity. So I guess it's just a large trade-off. So I appreciate the perspective there. I'm curious to get your guys' takes on whether you think vertical scaling or horizontal scaling is more like closer to what you think might be the end game. So to kind of define that a little bit more broadly, do you think the world will be, thousands of app chains where we have interoperability between all of them? Or do you think it could just be like a singular DeFi rollup and following that aggregation thesis where most everything happens there? We're sort of seeing this play out on Solana with all the altcoin volume there, but love to have both your takes on that.
Yeah, I think a few years ago the question was still undecided. I think today we have a much more preeminent answer where it's like horizontal scaling has somewhat won for now. I mean, we're nowhere near the end game, right? Like, I don't think like we're even a % of the way there. I think, if we were to look in the future, we're just at the start of all of this. But like, that doesn't mean that just because there's horizontal scaling that a vertical scaling solution like shouldn't work or shouldn't be very popular. I think these things, we always talk about it internally, these things follow power laws within power laws, right? And I think the great part about crypto is that even the rate of change itself is exponential. And the world has never seen anything like this, where it's like the internet, obviously the great network effect and all those things, but the network effect of say like ETH wallet addresses or Solana wallet addresses is exponentially above that, right? And so when it comes to horizontal scaling, yeah, I mean, we have all these solutions, but I don't think any of them necessarily will be the thing that lasts like 15 years from now. And I think your question was probably going to go into something like Mega ETH or all those things, which I think has come to the foreground a lot, which is how fast can you, or how much can you combine parallelization with the L2 thesis?
Yeah, I would say I have a slightly differing opinion over there. So I guess first of all, the end game that I see happening is that blockchains in general are winner take most. In the sense that there's probably not going to be like a billion different chains all with like 1/billionth of the amount of volume happening on each of them. Realistically, it's going to be probably like 3 to 5 chains that have most volume happening from there. And then there's going to be a long tail of chains where there's not really as much activity happening. In terms of how scaling is going to work, I don't think the end game is necessarily for there to be pure horizontal scaling in the sense where there's a lot of different chains, all with their own separate VMs where they all have to, definitely not asynchronously communicate with each other. I think realistically what's going to be much more common is for there to be single global VMs. And under the hood, you have some type of horizontal scaling happening over there. So an example over here would be Sui with their approach for, I guess their long-term approach for intra-validator sharding, which is where you just have like one VM that people interact with, but then under the hood, there's a lot of different shards that people are making that I guess are automatically being used to process these transactions. So I think realistically, initially what we're going to be seeing happening is a lot of virtual scaling right now, because I still think there's a lot of room for improvement in terms of performance from pure virtual scaling right now, or from pure vertical scaling right now. And I think in the longer term, you're going to have some types of horizontal scaling, where it's not necessarily up in the face for users. It's much more happening kind of behind the scenes.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. I think, as we've seen with both the rise of like Sei and Monad, for example, it's been really incredible, I guess, to see all these like ancillary researchers, I think, come out of the blue to help solve this problem, because like we are in some sense building the world computer here, right? And I think like people are still finally realizing that, at least as it pertains to the EVM. And the analogy that we always give is like the EVM is like when JavaScript was first made, where it was completely unusable and everyone hated it, and then V6 happened, and then suddenly it became like the thing, right? And now JavaScript is kind of everywhere in our lives. It's pervasive. You can't get rid of it even if you want to. So at some point, the VM kind of leaves the station, and you have to like get on the train, or you're just like not involved, right? And to some degree, I think the EVM is kind of like that, and so it's nice to see a lot of people, I think, kind of join in the effort to build the global computer.
Yeah, I mean, over the past couple of years, probably the single biggest thing that I've built up conviction around is exactly what you were saying, that the EVM is here to stay. Like, the EVM is not just a tech stack. It's essentially an ecosystem, and there's all the developers, there's the tooling, there's the mindshare, there's everything that comes with that makes it extremely difficult to replace. And similar to JavaScript, like JavaScript is not going anywhere. There's been several approaches that people have taken in the past 20 years to try to build a better tooling around that, and it hasn't really been replaced yet. And I think it's the exact same thing with the EVM. which is also why I'm not that bullish on alt VMs. I think it's extremely difficult to take an alt VM and have it get enough adoption to be able to get more market share than the EVM, at least definitely in a like 18-month future, and I think probably even in like a 3 to 5 year future.
Totally. And I think this segues into like a really interesting topic, which is, do you think the future is either going to be, monolithic or modular, or do you think it's more of like a horseshoe where we're seeing a convergence of ideas? Like an example would be, I think Mega ETH's a good example, bringing parallelism to ETH-L2, or Movement Labs, who are taking, the technology from Aptos and Sui and bringing that as, ETH-L2s. And on the other side, you have somebody like Monad, who's essentially building, for lack of better words, an EVM Solana. So that's almost going the other direction. So, love to have both your thoughts there. And I think Sei also falls in that bucket of like, taking, a modular technology in the EVM and obviously making that monolithic, but pushing it kind of to its max. So I'd love to hear, both your perspectives on that.
Yeah, so I definitely think the end game is going to be not just monolithic, not just modular. I think there's going to be both. And I think it's kind of inevitable for anyone that's successful in a monolithic chain, for any application, to try to have their own separate infrastructure. I think there's several different reasons that an application would want to do this. You were mentioning MEV before. I think that's the very strong value accrual mechanism where if you have your own infrastructure, then you're able to extract the MEV and have more of a value proposition for your users. I also think that there's probably less good reasons around that. Like, for example, some projects might just want to have a token, and having their own infrastructure would justify that more than having a governance token that doesn't really do anything. So I definitely think there's going to be a lot of projects trying to move towards having their own dedicated infrastructure. I think that's unavoidable. I also don't think it's going to be very easy for them to be successful over there. In general, I think the idea of having an application, like the idea of an app chain, I think is exceptionally difficult to pull off well. And there haven't really been too many examples of an app chain or an app rollup that have done a really, really good job. And the reason for that is you're basically trying to solve the two hardest problems in crypto, like building a successful application and also building successful infrastructure. And trying to do both of them well, like it's just really difficult to get that right. And one thing that also makes this even more difficult is it's really difficult to grow a community and grow an ecosystem if you're building very specialized infrastructure. Because if you're building, let's say, an app chain, and there's like one dedicated application for this chain, then you essentially have no credible neutrality. Like anything else that wants to be building on that application or on that infrastructure will be competing against that core application of the chain. So if you're like building a DEX app chain, app rollup, someone else wants to build a DEX, well, suddenly they know that they're kind of going to be handicapped from the get-go. So like there's a much weaker value proposition for them, and it makes it much harder for you to grow out your ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, I think basically all of that is true. Like, I mean, if you take, I guess what Jay said to the nth limit, you would kind of find a world with like 1 billion ledgers, like insanely high gas costs, right? Just like so much repeat computation that it would just be very hard to keep track of all these things. But I think, when we talk about monolithic or modular, I think some of these terms are a bit outdated because like we're already starting to see the integration. But coming from the investor point of view, I think a lot of people like these words in part because everyone kind of wants to be described as infrastructure, like the market prices infrastructure at a very different level as they would like say an app chain. I don't think that trade lasts for much longer. I mean, you're already starting to see the saturation of infra projects that are not infrastructure at all, right? I could go on with that list, but that probably has like, I don't know, a year or two left before people realize that they've been hoodwinked, right? Like a lot of these things that people believe are infrastructure, just kind of apps and vice versa. So yeah, I think the integration world is probably here to stay.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, Ani. I think the framing of just modular versus monolithic is becoming less and less true every day. Rather, I think we're headed more towards like an integrated or unified thesis, if you will. So definitely agree with that. That kind of segues into the next question I want to ask you guys and get your thoughts about. What are your thoughts on just the general maybe app chain flywheel? And I guess to share some context, we've been seeing this pattern where an app will launch on maybe a general purpose rollup or L1. Once they hit a certain level of liquidity, users, and just tap into network effects, they're like, hey, I want to capture more value, have more customizability and sovereignty. They launch an app chain. And then once they kind of hit their stride there, they're like, I want to be a general purpose app chain. And then other applications build on top of them. And then you complete that flywheel when an application built on top of them hits their stride and they're like, I want to launch my own app chain. So this kind of leads into a world where we're creating like an infinite number of app chains. So two questions to that. And again, we're seeing this thesis play out with Avo, DYDX, and Osmosis, where they're becoming more general execution layers. So I'd love to get your thoughts on, A, what do you think of this trend? Is it a bad thing? And do you think we'll see this continue?
Yeah, I think we're only at the start of all of this. I think in any computing paradigm, what generally happens is something like this, where there's a general purpose solution, and then as people get more sophisticated, the sophisticated actors create kind of their own enclave that later it's like the normies and everyone else like joins in, right? Which is great. I think like you only find what you can do at the frontier, right? At the limits, and like someone has to push the frontier, and if not, then it's like, what are we doing here, right? So I think, yeah, I'm very excited by all of this. I think the question that remains to be seen is like, for what, right? Like, who is succeeding by doing this? And like, I know we're still at the early stages, but like, I think people are willing to give app chains a bit of a break in the beginning, but like, I think that friction, that time to success is only going to keep getting shorter, as like people will want to see more progress sooner and sooner. But yeah, fundamentally, I think, you know, to Jay's point, like people really don't care a lot about the backend. They would just want stuff that works, right? And I think we have to like horseshoe around back to the main idea, which is like, do whatever you want, be integrated, be monolithic, be modular, but like focus on your users, like make something that people actually want, right? And don't just like die an infra project or an app chain.
Yeah, so I think the three questions were, do I think that this is like a good direction for these chains to be going in? I definitely think it's a good direction for people to be experimenting this way. I think that there hasn't been as much experimentation of like, especially bigger projects that have tried to go and expand to be general purpose. My general way of thinking about this is that if you're an app chain that has no community and you try to become general purpose, you're still going to be an app chain that has no community and has no traction. I think that if you're an app chain that has already gotten a ton of traction, so I think like DYDX would be a good example over here, where it's viewed as like a blue chip project, one of the most successful projects out there. I think there's a very good chance that they'll be able to become more general purpose and they'll be able to grow an ecosystem around that. And I think that's just because the biggest thing application developers care about is going to chains where they're actually able to get traction, where there's users that'll use their apps. I do think it ends up being like still a handicap to be launching on a chain where there's like already an existing application. But I think for a chain like DYDX, it can definitely work out much better than a chain where there's like no existing traction. With that being said, I do think the longer term, like it's probably better for application developers to go to general purpose ecosystems versus these app chains where there's already like an application that they'd be competing against.
Absolutely, yeah. My next question would be is, do you guys think that we're all headed towards the same place, whether it's Solana, Cosmos, Ethereum, wherein essentially the end goal might just be for everyone, you know, decentralized validation of basically all blocks, transactions, having very strong censorship resistance, and then having centralized block production like we see with like execution tickets, for instance. Do you guys think that's the end game for pretty much all chains, or do you see it differently?
At the moment, it does not seem to be the same direction that all ecosystems are moving in. I would generally say that Ethereum and Cosmos seem to be much more aligned in that sense, where they're generally moving towards the same direction. I think other chains like Solana are moving in a very different direction. I think over the next 12, 18 months, we'll start seeing much more, I think we'll start seeing what happens with these more monolithic chains, whether they start moving more towards the Ethereum view of the world. But I do think right now there's like definitely two different groups of projects out there.
Yeah, certainly, and I hope not. Like, I hope the end game is like very different, right? It's nice to see like this experimentation happening in real time, especially on the monolithic side. I think, as you know, obviously the meta I think has gone very modular, but you know, that's not just because it's the meta doesn't mean it's right. Like, I don't think any of us know for certain like which way this game is going to go. So no, I'm still excited by like all the progress on the monolithic side, whether it's like things like ZK Sync, right, and a lot of the ZK projects that I think are trying to be tightly vertically integrated. But yeah, well, you certainly need two, right? I think if everyone kind of ended up on the sort of modular Ethereum path, like you're already kind of seeing it. There is just like a lot of groupthink, at least, right? And some of it's right, some of it's wrong. But like you need people, I think, pushing back for us to like really see where we can go.
Yeah, totally. And I have a question more related to the short term versus long term. It seems that there is a trade-off between, you know, decentralization and latency. You look at Solana, which is aiming to be as fast as possible, and then Ethereum, which continues to optimize for maximal decentralization. How how do you see that trade-off in the short term? Do you think, and what do you think would be sufficiently decentralized, or if that's even important in certain case scenarios?
Yeah, so in general, I think that if you look at the layer ones that have launched in the past 2 years, essentially they've all been following the same approach. And I think the industry overall is moving towards that direction in general, which is that you want to offer the best user experience. That's what's actually going to get adoption. That user experience is going to be facilitated by a smaller set of validators that are going to need to be re-executing all the transactions. And I think that's generally the direction the industry is moving in. So I actually don't think the long term is going to be for most projects to be aiming for like 100,000 or like 1 million separate validators. I think it's much more important to be sufficiently decentralized and then focused on having ways for end users to verify the state of the blockchain without needing to re-execute everything. Because if you think about it, it's just so suboptimal, it's so inefficient to have like 1 million nodes that are all rerunning the same sets of transactions repeatedly. That's like not the end state that we want to go to. I think a better end state would be like 50, 100 validators that are like responsible for running the chain. And then as an end user, you just go to MetaMask, you're able to consume a zero knowledge proof of state transitions that happened. And this all happens behind the scenes, so you can just be very confident that state transitions are going well, and then you don't really need to go through and like re-execute all these transactions.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting to see, I think Andre Krone, the founder of Phantom, had this tweet where he was basically saying that like people are, crapping on Solana because people actually use the chain, right? And like that's kind of interesting to think about because like so much of the debate, at least as it pertains to Ethereum, is like, a lot of far strong concepts, right? I mean, like we're so focused on the future that I think we've kind of let the present down a little bit, right? And so that's to the credit of Solana and everyone else for like making a chain that like is accessible to just everyday users, right? Like when people first get access to crypto, it's like, what are they going to do and where, right? And that's like, in some sense, crypto is fighting a two-pronged war where it's like, in the long term, the computer should be, the overall consensus mechanism for the world. And then in the short term, like obviously things like meme coins and stuff like that will exist. And I think that's kind of where we've had less infra attention, right? How do you make something in the short term on the decentralization or not path that like people will actually just use?
Of course. I think the crux of the modular debate, if you will, is fragmentation of liquidity and fragmentation of state, ultimately. So that leads me to my next question, which is, what are your guys' thoughts on the state of interoperability, whether that might be shared sequencing, zk-IBC, anything you think might be interesting? And what do you think are some maybe estimated timelines for those things? Or do you think that there's a world, maybe in the shorter term, that these interoperability technologies are so good where we have balance abstraction, chain abstraction, where you can almost have the same kind of Solana style experience where it's like a unified account, but in the back end, you're still dealing with multiple chains?
Yeah, I don't think we're anywhere near that, honestly. Like, it'd be great to say and to see, but I think there's just like so many performance challenges that, there's the Elon line of like building the factory that creates, the factory, right? And like, it's almost like that where I think so many projects are trying to be the program that like helps build other programs, and that's just an enormous challenge, right? And even though there's like this inexorable march for people like trying to solve that, I think whether it's like UI, UX, or even like scaling as it pertains to the ZK stuff, like I think there's so many like mini technical challenges that just combine into like something way greater. So.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I don't think we're anywhere near that right now. I think I can pretty confidently say that in a 12-month window, like this is not going to become the norm for anyone to be doing things and like, or having this, for example, synchronous composability across multiple rollups. I don't see that becoming the norm in like the next 12 months. So I still think it's going to be much more for a longer term process to actually have this technology mature. I think there's still a lot of like research questions that are outstanding as well. I do think like some of the projects you mentioned, like there's a lot of innovation being done that I think could be interesting. I think like shared sequencers are going to be helping a lot. There's like, I think projects that are trying to have like PBS where builders are building across multiple separate rollups, and I think a direction like that would make a lot of sense for enabling like synchronous composability between different rollups. But at the end of the day, I still think it's not something that end users will be using anytime in the next 12 months.
Absolutely, yeah. Definitely agree with both of those takes there. I guess last question here, because I think we're just about out of time. Last question for you both would be, for our audience, especially within this just monolithic versus modular debate, and then more pertinently, probably the unified integrated thesis, what are some themes, technologies, or even projects you think our audience should be looking out for?
Yeah, I'll keep this pretty brief. I think parallelization is like going to be one of the biggest things that will be explored this year. I think there's like Monad, there's Sei, you mentioned Mega ETH as well, you mentioned Movement, like tons of projects are going to be exploring this, and I think that's going to be one of the biggest trends for this year.
Yeah, just to echo what Jay said, I think like this is the first time in a while in the space where I'm like just uncertain of how the game will end up in a great way, right? Like I wake up and I'm just so excited because it's like finally people are tackling the challenges that I wish they did like years ago, right? When I think there will be like this big trifecta between Monad, Sei, and Mega ETH that like, you know, it is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in some sense, right? So that's what I'm super excited for.
I actually completely agree with that. Like, I think like you, I've seen like literally hundreds of like roll-up as a service, interoperability, DA layers, like Cosmos layer like projects. And this is also, in my opinion as well, one of the first times where I'm like, I have really no idea where this is going to go. I know what the end game principles might be, but like no idea which approach might get there and the fastest. So completely agree with that. Yeah, I think that's all the time we have. If you guys can give a hand for our panelists.
Thank you, speakers. We have room 108 for a Q&A, so if you guys can make your way there. Feel free if you have additional questions and want to continue the conversation. Otherwise, please stay for our next session, which will start in a minute or two.